Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense. Online at pressupinc.com. I remember reading something by... It was a, I forget what he was even about, but it was a story by Alex Ross in The New Yorker who writes about classical music, and he opens it saying, I hate classical music, not the thing, but the name. And then he goes on to say why that damages classical music to call it that. I sometimes feel the same about pedestrian and pedestrianism. Do you ever?
A little bit. People definitely have said that to me, that they... the pedestrian has become a byword for, slow or plodding or whatever, right? And that we shouldn't really use pedestrian or try to avoid it. So I do tend to try to use walk and walking and foot and stuff like that. But, pedestrian is kind of a technical term almost, right? And if you're talking about traffic, if you're talking about vehicles, it makes sense to talk about pedestrians.
Right. But why not just people, I wonder?
Well, because people use all kinds of ways to get around, right? So, and this kind of actually goes to the heart of one of the issues around walking and walking advocacy, which is cyclists will self-identify as cyclists. And drivers will think of themselves as drivers, especially if, something comes up that might inconvenience them.
Sure.
But people who walk don't necessarily self-identify as pedestrians. You can think of it as a lack of class consciousness or something like that. And that actually makes it hard to advocate for pedestrian stuff because people don't really think of themselves as a pedestrian first of all. So you can't really just say, even though everyone is a pedestrian, essentially, not everyone really sees themselves as a pedestrian. And it's kind of important to sort of say, these are people who are walking, and they all count as pedestrians.
I'm coming to you today from Toronto, Canada. Where else but Toronto, Canada, here on Notebook on Cities and Culture, speaking with a walker in this city by the name of Dylan Reid. He is a senior editor at Spacing magazine. He was on the Toronto Pedestrian Committee. He is a co-founder of Walk Toronto. He is, well, I'll put it this way. He's sitting across from me, but we're in his neighborhood. What neighborhood is this? What part of Toronto are we in?
Well, it's actually a funny question because we're sort of between two neighborhoods. To the west is Riverdale, which is now a very, very prosperous neighborhood, highly sought after in the real estate. And to the east of us is the Pocket, which is an up-and-coming neighborhood, increasingly sought after. But we're in this little dead zone, and there's a lot of these in Toronto that are sort of between two neighborhoods that don't really have their own identity. Normally what I tell people is that I live at Pape and Danforth or off the Danforth. And people know what that means because the Danforth is a really well-known street, very vibrant, active street. It has an identity as the Greek town, but also has identity as a vibrant retail space with lots of interesting shops and stuff like that.
People did seem to know where I was going when I was saying I had to go to the Danforth later. How did it become such a well-known street?
It's always been one of the main streets of Toronto. So it was one of the big streets when Toronto sort of spread east. It was one of the main arteries of that. So it's always been a major street. And it's also the primary street on the east side of the Don Valley. And Toronto is split up by ravines, and they really shape the way Toronto has been is organized. And so the Danforth is kind of the core of that sort of cross the Don Valley neighborhood. But then, of course, what really gave it its identity was the influx of Greek businesses there. And the whole neighborhood used to be very heavily Greek for a long time. Now, a lot of those Greek families have moved out now, moved farther east often, but it still remains the heart of the Greek community.
I noticed the Greektown branding still survives on signs and in ads and whatnot. It's still seemingly thought of that way.
Yes, and even if there's not as many Greek families in the area as there used to be, it's still the place that Greek families come to. One of my coworkers is Greek, and I talk to her, and she knows all the businesses, and they come down here regularly, seeing it as the sort of center of the Greek community. So yeah, so it's really surviving that, and of course there's a thing called the Taste of the Danforth every year, which is this huge event. It gets about 1 million visitors, I think. And it's just a street festival, but it gets a massive number of people coming to it. It's super popular, and it really gives that identity to the area.
Mm. And when you're thinking about walking in Toronto, are you thinking in terms of streets, or how do you frame it? Do you think about favorite streets to walk, or do you think about what is the way you conceive of the space when you're talking about walking through it?
There's two different answers to that. So one thing I would say is that a lot of times when you think about walking, you're thinking of areas. So people will walk in Kensington Market, in the Annex, in Riverdale, for example. On the other hand, that's sort of more if you're going for a walk, as it were. If you're kind of going to go somewhere to shop, for example, stuff like that, Toronto has extraordinarily long stretches of vibrant retail. Queen Street West is probably the most remarkable one. If you start at University and you can go all the way to the railway tracks at the beginning of Parkdale, almost that entire strip has active, vibrant retail, shifting in style and type all the way along. And that's I'm not sure quite how long a walk it is, at least 45-minute walk. And it's quite extraordinary. And so that would be the other kind of walking, is you just go to a strip and you kind of walk all the way down it. And because Toronto is a grid city, it has these long, long stretches of main streets that you can just walk for a long time. And there's always interest, even if they're not, like the Danforth changes up a lot as you walk along it, but it's always somewhat interesting. And there's always little pockets of interesting stuff to see, even if there's stretches that are not very active, where there's a lot of closed storefronts, that kind of thing.
It seems to be a city, Toronto does, where there are a multitude of ways to get around, from the sort of bike share system to the subway, streetcars, buses, driving, what have you. What do you learn about Toronto when you walk it, as opposed to doing any of those other things?
Well, I think in some ways the same thing that you learn as you walk anywhere, right? You're just walking more slow. You're more slow. You're also more open, right? When you're walking, there's nothing separating you from what's around you, unlike even in a streetcar, or even on a bike where you're moving a little bit faster, and you're on a machine, even if it's a pedal self-driven machine. So when you're walking, you're just that much more open to all the experiences that you see. So you're going to hear more sounds, you're going to smell more smells. May not always be something you want to do, but sure, you will. And that'll give you more of a flavor of how the city is. You have more time to notice things. You have more time to notice sort of interesting architectural features, or look at the people who are going by. You're able, it's much easier to just stop and browse and look into a store window. Or to go into the store if the store window is interesting enough. So you're getting that much depth of experience in a way that you can't really get in other ways. Although, cycling around Toronto is great, and you can certainly see more of it. And streetcars are also actually a really fun way to see Toronto as well. But it's not the same. It's going to be a different experience.
What are some sort of distinctive, quintessentially Toronto things you personally have experienced while walking?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Quintessentially Toronto.
What counts to you as quintessentially Toronto? Because it's never the same for anybody, any two people. Everybody has some different idea about what actually does define Toronto, if anything.
Yeah, and Toronto is a city that is not super confident in its own definition of itself. People might feel that Toronto doesn't necessarily have that much that's specific to Toronto or super interesting. But actually there's a lot of things, although it's not that easy to just sort of pull them up. Right. I would say, of course, the variety of people, in terms of ethnicities, but also in languages. So if you're walking along Toronto, you'll hear many different languages as you pass. And that's true in any part of the city, not just in sort of ethnic neighborhoods. But also true in terms of the types of people, in terms of whether they're wealthy or they're punk or they're alternative or they're, middle class, or all the different kinds of people. They tend to mix even now fairly well in Toronto, although despite, all the issues of separation of classes and stuff like that. So that's definitely one thing. Another thing is the small scale retail, which I think is quite quintessentially Toronto. Like I was saying, you can get small scale retail for extraordinarily long stretches. And a weird variety of architecture. So everyone kind of built their own thing, and there was trends, but usually there's 2 or 3 trends at the same time, and then stuff gets filled in and knocked down. So you have this real variety of architecture. And one thing I find interesting, people sometimes complain about façadism, they call it, where you take a historical building and you build a new building behind it. But that's actually a kind of interesting thing in Toronto. It enables the city to continue to grow without losing its old character. So you actually get a lot of that in Toronto, where you have kind of these interesting buildings that are a mix of old and new, and you can see how they've tried to integrate them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But it's an often interesting, it's an interesting thing to keep an eye out in Toronto.
So did all these elements of Toronto fascinate you immediately when you first came here as a student?
As a student, I was in residence, and I didn't really. I guess as a student in Toronto, what was interesting was, I came from a not small but smaller city. Was the variety of experience and interests, like interesting restaurants, interesting neighborhoods. At the time, it wasn't as slick as Toronto is now, but there was some of it. There were elements of the high, expensive areas, but also very poor areas right beside each other. But also like the variety of film, for example, that was available. That was a big thing for me. I was really into film at the time, and there was so much more to see in Toronto. And of course, that's just expanded now. There's a film festival every week practically in Toronto now.
Right, even over and above the one that everybody knows about, there's some kind of film festival going on somewhere, effectively.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. So when I was a teenager and came to Toronto as a university student, that was something that really struck me. Now, and then when I came back to Toronto, it was kind of a gradual process of getting to learn the city. So it was very gradual. And Toronto isn't something that shows off its qualities right away, right? You land in Toronto, if you fly in, you drive down this horrible, massive highway into downtown. You see big buildings. You don't see any really gorgeous architecture or beautiful streets or anything like that. There's utility poles everywhere. The first impression of Toronto is not necessarily that exciting. Traffic's really heavy. But it's a city that, as you get to know it, and especially as you walk it kind of offers up its joys, and they kind of grow on you. So it's a city that grows on you, and it's remarkable how much of a depth of a attachment people have to Toronto once they've lived here for a while, compared to the very negative impressions people have if they haven't been here, if they've only been here shortly.
They have very negative impressions?
Well, Toronto is widely hated in Canada.
I hear that, but it's still kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it has to do with, like the media is focused here, banking is focused here. A lot of the sort of levers of power that people experience in their lives are concentrated in Toronto. And people have a very weird perception of it, too. I met a woman from Halifax once at a wedding outside of Toronto. She was like, I could never live in Toronto because I like to walk everywhere. Which was, to me, like an incomprehensible statement, because I lived in Toronto, I didn't have a car. At the time, I didn't even bike, and I literally walked everywhere. And, but that's the impression people have, is they have this impression of a big city with all traffic and highways and tall buildings, and that's about it.
Why did the lady from Halifax think you couldn't walk anywhere here? I'm confused as to what you think people did do, I'm confused as to what people, I'm confused as to what she thought people did do.
I imagine she thought people drove along big expressways to their work. That's what I imagine.
All expressways and towers.
Yeah, I think that's literally what people imagine. The reality is wildly different, but you don't really know that unless you actually come here.
I would guess it's the same way in which New York was hated in the States for a long time. It was just the big city over there with quote unquote big city problems. I don't know. It's a way. It's a place for other Canadians to point to and say, at least I'm not there, in some sense.
Maybe, but the irony, of course, is that I know so many people most people in Toronto have come from elsewhere, whether it's elsewhere in the world or elsewhere in Canada. the majority of the population has actually come from somewhere else. My wife is one of the few people I know who actually grew up in Toronto. It has that quality of New York for the United States. In Canada, Toronto is the place you go if you want to do something, if you have ambitions, whatever. And that creates appeal, but of course it also creates resentment too, right? There's a certain resentment of that, it's taking people away. I have to go there to get ahead. I can't just do that where I'm from, that kind of thing. I mean, it's changing a little bit because obviously the West is becoming much more prosperous, but there used to be that. And I think also people, because Toronto doesn't have an iconic kind of appeal. I mean, at least New York, there was all those movies with montages of people going down Broadway and enjoying themselves and seeing the lights. Toronto doesn't really have that. It doesn't have that instant, this looks great. This is a beautiful kind of setting kind of thing. It's not a beautiful city. So people don't have any kind of counterexample to go against the kind of whatever resentment they feel about its size and dominance, economic and media dominance.
I guess it's similar in Los Angeles. Many films, for example, are shot here just as many films are shot in Toronto, but with an eye toward often not making it look distinctive. So there's few icons. I mean, you have the CN Tower. That's something.
Yes, but it's not pretty. I mean, it's
kind of cool. I don't know.
It is very cool. I love it. But I imagine if I was living in Toronto in the 70s and a little old, maybe I wouldn't have liked it because it's suddenly new. But it is iconic. But it's not. It doesn't really have that sort of beauty appeal. It is definitely iconic though, and I think it's contributed a lot to Toronto in that way. It also helps you get around because you can always see which way is south.
Navigational aid.
Yeah.
That's true, but for people trying to get acquainted with Toronto, what will they see when they open Spacing magazine?
Well, I have had several people tell me that Spacing, people who have come from other cities in Canada, that Spacing was what first got them to fall in love with Toronto, or got them on the way to falling in love with Toronto. And what I think Spacing brings out is Toronto has so much small interest in beauty. It's not stuff that you can kind of put on a postcard necessarily. But there's so many small, interesting things about Toronto, and there's so much activity here and so many interesting things being done. It's amazing hive of kind of creativity. And I think Spacing kind of opens that up to people. So when people come to Toronto and they're like, I don't even know where to start, and I don't really see an opening. And then Spacing can be a way of saying, here are things to look at. Here are interesting programs or ideas to be part of. Here are people to follow. Here's something really interesting about that building that looked really boring, but now suddenly when you find out more about it, it's like, wow, here's a really interesting policy discussion that you hadn't really thought about that's really actually happening vibrantly in Toronto. So I think that Spacing really, it kind of, and it's interesting. One of the things that Toronto is actually strongest at, like it's really, stands out in the world is photoblogging. We've had some amazing photobloggers, many of whom contribute to Spacing. And I feel like it's related to the fact that Toronto is not obviously beautiful. So photobloggers are forced to be really creative in finding the beauty in Toronto. It's like, where am I going to look for, and how am I going to make Toronto seem interesting, or using that photographer's eye to really pick out what it is, because it's all the small things, right? It's not that sort of big vista that everyone takes a picture of. It's a lot of place for photobloggers to go look around and find small things. And again, that's walking is how you do that as well, right? Toronto is really a city that, if in order to really appreciate it, you kind of have to walk in a way. There are bus tours of Toronto, but I'm not really sure what they're going to be looking at that much. It's really a city where you walk around, and that's where you start to really absorb the vibrancy and the beauty of the city.
It reminds me of sort of the reverse notion that cities that are in really striking settings ultimately, in a way, become victims of those settings. San Francisco is certainly a name you could bring up there, or Vancouver. I mean, if the setting really captivates people, expectations get raised so high that the city itself can never really meet them. I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying, Toronto, you can focus on the city in Toronto because there's not some like majestic vista taking you away from it. You know what I mean?
That's very true. Toronto is in the blandest possible landscape. I've often had people from Vancouver complain that they miss having any scenery at all. And even places like Quebec City and Montreal. I mean, Montreal is a beautiful mountain in the middle. Quebec City is on the striking bluff. Halifax is on the ocean. So Toronto has that Midwestern city kind of thing. Even though it's not on the plains, it still has that Midwestern thing of basically being flat on the edge of a, pleasant but not like super exciting body of water. And yes, I think there's some truth to that you really have to focus on the city. But I think that's also one of the reasons people don't have that quick love of Toronto, because they don't say, wow, this is magnificent. They look at it and go, what is this? It's that kind of thing where sometimes something is very visually clear and you understand it, and sometimes something's very visually muddled, and it takes a while for your brain to kind of digest it. Toronto's like that. It's it has an okay, if you go to the islands, that's probably the best place to view Toronto, and it has an okay kind of skyline, but even that's been muddled because there's now so much there. So there's not that, but the skyline from the island is probably the best and most striking image of Toronto. But even that's, it's not New York.
Right. I mean, I find with the cities that immediately captivate people because of their nature or what have you, so they just have some high impact element. I mean, people say, oh, I love this city. But the quicker they are to say that, the quicker they are to stop loving it as well. I mean, it seems like Toronto is more, you're slow to come to love it, but also people, once they decide they're in, they're very much in, right?
Yeah, I think that's very true. Exactly that. Once they're in, they're in. I wouldn't want to speak to other cities because that's not really, but I think that's very true of Toronto. It takes a while to get to know it and appreciate it, but once you're in, people get really attached.
When was it that you first started thinking consciously about Toronto?
I don't know. I would say I'd been back living here for a few years before I really started thinking about Toronto as a city. So I was like everyone else. It kind of grew on me slowly. And now I'm all in, as it were.
I mean, you have to, I guess, have that point where you realize things make Toronto different from other cities, right? But what kind of things make people realize that here? Because to really know you're in a place, you have to know it's different from other places, right?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't actually pinpoint exactly what it was. I mean, by the time spacing started, which was in 2002, I was already really keen to be involved with it, and I was already really keen to start working with the city. And I'm not really sure where I'd been back here for 7 years or so by that time. I'm not really sure what it was that, how that happened. I started off where I lived and, working at the university or on contract in different places. And it was kind of this gradual thing. And at some point suddenly I was hooked, and I'm not really sure how, I would say. But then it was interesting when I got involved with spacing. I also met Todd Irvin, who's a friend of Sean's, and they were the ones. They started doing these walks, and that's when I first met Sean McAuliffe. And so I started going on the walks with them, and that is when I really got to know Toronto. So I had already become attached to the city and was really involved and interested in things. But the walks were how I got to know parts of Toronto that otherwise I would just never really had any reason to go to. We would just go to a subway station and start walking from there. And that was a real education. And I have to say, I would recommend that to anyone. We would walk in a group of, a few people. Sometimes there are quite a lot of people. We might be up to 15 people. Sometimes there's just 3 or 4 people. But we would just go somewhere and start walking, without any very firm idea of where we wanted to go or where we wanted to end up. That really made such a difference to my depth of knowledge of Toronto, because I started seeing those parts I hadn't seen before, experiencing the variety of the city. We were doing it at night, which kind of gives a different kind of feel. I mean, day and night both work, but they're quite different. And of course, walking in a group is good because then everyone feels comfortable going to spaces that you might not feel comfortable walking individually. And that was an education. We did that every week for a few years, and they sort of tailed off after a while. But that was definitely my education in the wholeness of Toronto, as opposed to just, the parts of Toronto that I knew because I worked or lived there or visited them sometimes.
Now, what kind of things would surprise you on these walks?
All kinds of things, but it's a lot to, interesting. Like, you start noticing the different built forms in Toronto, right? Like the different ways that people build houses, the different ways houses are spread out, the different ways that main streets are, from the older city to the newer city. You discover so many hidden routes. So, ravine walks that you would never have guessed existed, or little byways or railway overpasses for pedestrians and such like that. There's so many things that are surprising in Toronto that just tucked in there. Those are the kinds of things that were, often astonishing, or, abandoned areas. I went for a long walk with a friend just a few weeks ago, and, in this tradition. And we found this whole area of the last remaining slaughterhouse in Toronto and all the meatpacking businesses around it, which I knew of theoretically, but I'd never actually seen it.
It was an active slaughterhouse?
It's an active slaughterhouse. It was full of all these humming refrigeration trucks, right? It was making these crazy humming sounds. But the funny thing is, we came upon it after, first of all, we'd hit this place where this creek is channelized, which I'd never known about, right? Which is this weird little short space of channelized creek. And then there was like a residential area, and you walk up this little road that seems to be in the middle of nowhere with not even a sidewalk, and there's trees around it, and suddenly you're in this meatpacking district. And then you come out of the meatpacking district, and suddenly you're in this whole new neighborhood that's just being built. So, it's amazing how much different things there are in Toronto. And I think one of the things about walking is you start to understand the pace of a city and the rhythm of a city and the way these things can be kind of right beside each other. Whereas if you're driving, you probably would never drive there in the first place. Right. And if you did drive there, you would pass them really quickly. So you wouldn't really get that sense of their proximity and distance from each other. And walking, you really get that. And you start to see these weird kind of rhythms in the city.
It gives you might say, the highest resolution view of the city if you're walking. It's very low resolution to drive because the only points you really see are where you left from, your pathway, and where you're going. Walking takes you down to the smallest possible unit, doesn't it?
Well, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good metaphor for it. Cycling gives you a different kind of feeling, but you might not see the details as much. You also might choose routes differently because of cycling. Right. So walking really gives you that flexibility to kind of go anywhere, as it were. Just take this sudden route. You can stop at a corner and decide and take a sudden detour, or cross this little space, or that kind of thing.
One of the things you write in Spacing, one of the things you regularly do, or at least semi-regularly, is writing about city books, shall we say, or books on cities. How often do you encounter city writing that is really applicable to your Toronto experience?
I would say quite often. Toronto is quite a nexus for a lot of issues that are applicable to cities at the moment. I mean, it's been interesting because Spacing started kind of just as the whole urbanism thing started to develop, but there wasn't a lot of writing about it yet, I think, at that point. And it's really exploded as Spacing has continued. So it's been really interesting to kind of see the depth of discussion about cities kind of build up as we published. I would say that a lot of Toronto is a good sized city. It's 2.5 million, 5 million for the metropolitan region. It's not so big that it's kind of exceptional. It's the biggest city in Canada, so a lot of kind of city issues kind of get focused on it. So, and it's, there's immigrants, a very big immigrant population as well. So, and it's very prosperous, unlike, a lot of Midwestern cities. Toronto's doing very, very well. But at the same time has a great deal of poverty in it, more poverty than most Canadian cities. So, it's actually a kind of a good cauldron, as it were, for a lot of city issues that people are talking about when they talk about urbanism in general. Mm-hmm. So, whether it's creative cities, Toronto has a huge creative population, whether it's the gradual segregation of wealthy and poor, which is something that Toronto, one of the earliest studies on that came out of Toronto, whether it's transit or transportation, which Toronto was been in the midst of a huge discussion for the last few years about. And, Toronto at the same time is developing an LRT, which is part of the overall movement in North America. At the same time, there's a lot of resentment of that. There's heavy congestion. There's massive arguments about how to deal with it. So all of these different things, there's massive intensification and growth in density. There's huge towers going up. There's condos going up. There's new commercial buildings going up. There's architecture of all different kinds, good and bad, going up. So whenever you read a book about cities in general, it often applies to Toronto. There's something in that book that is actually an active discussion in Toronto, which I think is really exciting.
We could say every current of 21st century city development has some aspect of it going on in Toronto. It's represented somehow in Toronto. Whenever you read about a city issue in the developed world, Toronto has some reflection of that.
Yeah, in the developed world, obviously there's issues in the developing world, such as slums that aren't so relevant to Toronto.
I haven't seen any shanty towns here, not yet.
In fact, there was a small one at one point, but it got cleaned up. But yeah, I think that's true. I think that, Toronto, can, whatever you're reading about in urbanism, Toronto is actually a quite intense example of. I think that's quite true. Maybe not everything. I'm sure there's some things people come up with that aren't, but for very many things, and certainly in any book that you're reading, there's going to be something that's going to be applicable, I think.
So as urbanism has come back to the fore in the 21st century, do you find now that spacing is assuming a higher level of sophistication about this kind of thing on the part of the reader than it did 10 years ago, 12 years ago when it started?
That's a good question. I would say our sophistication has grown with our readers. Obviously when we started, we were all just people who love cities and were really interested in Toronto. What
were you writing about at the very, very beginning? What was spacing doing when it just started?
The impetus for spacing was anti-postering bylaw. The city of Toronto was amalgamated in 1998 and began harmonizing its bylaws across the 6 older cities. 6 older cities. Postering came up, and they proposed an extremely restrictive postering bylaw. Because, of course, the other thing was that with the new amalgamation, the majority of the city councillors were from suburban areas who were not used to postering and didn't approve of it. Spacing started out of a fight by a group called the Toronto Public Space Committee, which is still in existence in one of its various forms, to basically fight this anti-postering bylaw, in which it was successful. So our first issue was all about postering, but once we started on it, we thought, well, there's all these other interesting issues that we want to talk about as well that were vibrant in Toronto at the time, including there was a new square, Dundas Square, which was a sort of private-public partnership. We wrote about that. And then there were so many neat things, like people had all these cool things in Toronto, and this was before. There was certainly the web and there was a little bit of blogging already, but it was really before that was big. So there wasn't a lot, for all these little cool things, there wasn't a place to put them. And certainly the mainstream press in Toronto was completely uninterested in this stuff. So, featuring interesting street art and local initiatives and artistic projects and that kind of thing. And it was all happening and nobody was really talking about it in the mainstream media. So, and then our second issue was about walking, pedestrianism. And that was a themed issue. And then, of course, we still had all this other stuff. And then gradually, as we kept writing, we got more sophisticated. Our writers got more sophisticated. We got more sophisticated writers. And at the same time, I think the overall discourse became more complex and more in-depth. So we were kind of I would say riding the wave. I would say we caught a wave and we've been riding it.
Specifically about walking, I mean, what's going on with walking right now in Toronto? Why does it seem to be a wave of its own, I suppose?
I would like to think it's a wave. I wouldn't say it is a wave at the moment. I would say walking remains as it has been since we did our issue and since I became co-chair of the Pedestrian Committee. I'd say it's always is kind of bubbling away at a certain level, but it never breaks out into a big issue. And in some ways that's beneficial for walking because people aren't really against it the way you have people who are against cycling or who are against streetcars, right? Like no one is against walking,
right?
Or almost no one. So even if you ask, suburban councillors who are very conservative and car-oriented, they won't say that they don't think people should walk or that we shouldn't build sidewalks necessarily.
It doesn't demand a huge amount of infrastructure.
Well, but that's the problem, is that there's a lot of infrastructure that could benefit from, and also a lot of operations. For instance, Walk Toronto now, which I'm now part of, we're trying to get the city to clear all sidewalks of snow in the winter. At the moment it clears suburban sidewalks, but not the downtown sidewalks, which are more complicated to clear.
That seems like the reverse of what you'd want to do necessarily. Like if any sidewalk needs clearing, it's downtown.
Well, exactly. And they're going to start clearing Main Street downtown sidewalks next year.
Do people just kind of push their way through the snow right now?
Well, the property owners are required to do it. But of course, not every property owner does. Some are negligent, some are absentee landlords. There's many, many different reasons. Some are elderly or disabled or whatever. So there's many reasons why people can't do it. And so the sidewalks are not cleared. And they are indeed, ironically, the most heavily used sidewalks. So that will cost a lot of money. And it's unlikely that the city will commit to it, but we're going to try pushing for that anyway. But that's operations money. It's not infrastructure. It's everyday maintenance. And part of the reason, of course, is that, again, walking is a motherhood issue that's never really on top of anyone's list. Yeah. So there's not a big political percentage in helping this, even though, there are lots of people who walk out of there. I mean, walking in Toronto is massive because not only do something like 10% of the population walk to work, but another 30% of the population walks to a transit stop, which is often just as long as that walk to work, and takes transit. So there's a lot of people walking out of their front doors and walking somewhere during the day, but it's not really top of everyone's mind. And so, so it's hard to actually get investment in walking, even if everyone is generally on side with it. Like the walking, the pedestrian projects group at the city is smaller than the cycling projects group, even though there are far more pedestrians and cyclists in Toronto, simply because cyclists are more vocal, which, good for them. And they can get, more political commitment on side. So, the kind of low keyness of walking is both a benefit and a curse. And as if it was high profile, that would also be a benefit and a curse. So, it's a bit of one or the other. I guess maybe one thing that is, of course, striking about Toronto over the last few years, and in the sense that walking has become a big thing, is the new population downtown. The population of Toronto's downtown over the last 10 years has increased by, I think, 100,000 people, and half of those people walk to work. So we now suddenly have a huge number of people who walk to work every day, which before we had quite a few, but it was not the same kind of intensity. And that has been a massive change, and possibly in the future that will kind of lead to a greater prominence for walking.
Might walking be better conceived of as the sort of the fabric that connects all other forms of transportation? Because you're always going to be doing some kind of walking, even those who can't walk. They're wheelchairing between a streetcar or a bus or an airplane. There's always some walking or walking-like activity that people are going to have to do, and it's a way of just. You can describe it as what holds everything else together, can't you?
I have, in fact, described it that way, I think, in the past. Yes, I totally agree with you. So yes, indeed. Although, people who walk from their door to their car and then from their car through the parking garage to the elevator, there is some walking there, but it's not exactly the same thing, right?
They'd rather not be doing even that walking, probably.
They would rather not be doing even that walking, and it's not like they're actually getting out into the street and the sort of public space of walking. So
they never walk in the city. It's always in this sort of quasi-public, never private or quasi-public spaces to get to a specific destination.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, although theoretically you can say everyone's a pedestrian, and I like to say that sometimes, the practicality of it is that those people are not really walking in the city. And, if they're living in the suburbs, even when they go shopping, they may drive to a mall, and the walking they will do will be across parking lots and such like that. So there are people in Toronto who live lives in which there is really very little walking in the city. But there are the majority of people, I would say. I mean, if we have 40% who walk part of the way to work in a substantial way, there's also kids who walk to school. There's lots of people who may drive to work, but they may walk to, their local shops and stuff like that. So it is actually a very large percentage of the population who walks in one way or another. But people just think of it as natural. They don't really think of it as a conscious decision, in a sense. It's just what you have to do. And a lot of it, I mean, on the one hand, it's great to have utilitarian walking and that people are walking for a purpose. But on the other hand, it's often people are doing it because there's not really another choice, right? Because they don't have a car. They only have one car and they can't use it for this short trip or that kind of thing. So it's not so much that they're doing it out of a love of walking as that, it's what they have to do. So one has to keep that in mind, that not everyone who walks is a walking advocate. They may be walking because, it's what they have to do.
Now, in terms of walking and walkers or otherwise, in any sense, how different is the Toronto of 2002 when spacing started versus the Toronto of today?
Well, I would say the one key thing is what I was saying earlier about the massive increase in the number of people who live downtown and walk to work downtown. That has been huge. Probably 50,000 people, but essentially half or more than half the population of the downtown walks to work, which is really quite astonishing. And it's getting more and more as more condos go up downtown and more office buildings. That's been happening. So that's a huge change. I also think that people are somewhat more conscious about walking and walking safety and what needs to be done. The city, and also another thing that's changing is innovative ways of walking. So there's two streets were closed to traffic in the campuses of Ryerson and University of Toronto, for example. Just small streets, but it's a little something. The idea of shared streets or streets where there's more flexibility. So now it's possible to actually have a patio, say, on a parklet in a parking spot, and restaurants are allowed. And that's a legislative change that happened, because before you couldn't carry alcohol across the sidewalk, and now you can. So that kind of thing, and that consciousness that walking, well, and the other thing is the consciousness by businesses, I think. That's probably the hugest thing. Conscious by businesses that walking is where they get most of their business. Right. So the Golden Mile, not the Golden Mile, sorry, that's in Scarborough. But there's a strip of retail along Bloor between Church and Avenue Road, which is very, very high rents. It's the posh shopping district, and the Bloor Yorkville BIA business improvement area, and they invested $20 million, $10 million up front, and then $10 million that they're going to repay the city. In making beautiful sidewalks, new trees, that kind of thing, widening the sidewalks. And they did it because they know that most of the people who go into their shops are going in on foot. And that's a new conscious. And the Yonge BIA, which is farther downtown Yonge BIA, sorry, which is farther down Yonge Street around Dundas Square, they have been investing in different pilot projects and things like that to see what they can do, because they have massive pedestrian presence. And they know that most of the people who come into their shops are on foot as well. And that's consciousness is expanding across the city. And I think that having businesses on side is a really powerful in terms of getting walking infrastructure actually implemented and improvements actually implemented, and getting people to actually kind of embrace walking and realize its full value. And so I think that's probably one of the big changes is that consciousness among retail businesses that walking is a really valuable resource that's worth investing in.
It seems like it's one of these feedback loops. More people go downtown, businesses see they're there, they realize that's where the money is, because they're already living here, so we have to get them that way, and then people see businesses responding and are more lured to downtown. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, actually, it was always true. It's just that businesses didn't realize it. Businesses assumed that for a long time that most of the people who came to the businesses were driving. And that the Toronto Centre for Active Transportation has done a series of studies that showed that that's not the case. But I think businesses also began to realize that's not the case. They began to realize that, in fact, even if, first of all, a lot of people were taking transit to their areas. And second, even if people drove, they parked, and then they walked. And that it was actually the walking that got people to actually go into the business and to find businesses they didn't know about that weren't their destination. So that's been kind of a gradually increasing mentality among the retail business community in Toronto, and I think that that's really, really valuable.
Can you still find things that surprise you while walking in Toronto?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Really?
Like I was saying, I just went on this walk with a friend of mine a few weeks ago, and it was full of surprises. Abandoned buildings, new artworks, random channelized creeks, like new areas that I had no idea about or that I'd heard about and didn't really know. And for example, we went into the Slaughterhouse district, right. And in the Slaughterhouse district is this gorgeous Art Deco building, beautiful Art Deco building, which has been abandoned for a while. I had no idea, right? It was extraordinary, and it's kind of in the middle of this industrial area. And it was once a factory. It was obviously someone invested in making a gorgeous factory. Nice. And there was a development notice on it that said that someone is planning to buy it and restore it and turn it into some kind of, I think, a sort of shared multi-business, small business area, which is a great idea. I had no idea. I mean, it's a great project. I don't know if it's going to come to fruition or not, and I don't even know if this building is protected under heritage laws and whatever. But to find this building was one thing. To discover that this project was another thing. I mean, these are the things that continuously surprise. And the other, I guess, the thing is that there is so much activity in Toronto that even if a space didn't surprise you once, it may surprise you in the future.
Yes. Just come back later and see what it is. I mean, when you find one of these abandoned Art Deco buildings, shall we say, how easy is it to find out what the story is with them? Like, why is this here? Why is it like this? When you're trying to find that out, is that usually possible in Toronto?
Toronto has an amazing supply of people who are fascinated by its history. So I was with my friend Colin Marshall, who is also with Walk Toronto and has been part of this walking group for a long time, and he knew the story of this place. And I'm not sure how he knew it, but he did. And so he told me what it used to be, and he said, "Oh, this must be this place," and whatever. So Toronto has an amazing store of people like that. And if I can do a quick plug, Spacing is doing we're just about to publish 50 objects that identify or that symbolize Toronto, and that's by one of our longtime contributors, Jamie Bradburn, and he writes a column called Torontoist, which is won National Magazine Award, in fact this year, and he writes a historicist column with some other people, and they're always exploring the history of Toronto, like different buildings or different stories or aspects like that. And there is an amazing supply of people, and I think it goes back to what I was saying about that kind of depth of love of Toronto. It takes a while for people to get into it, but once they're into it, they're really into it. And so Toronto has had for a long time these people who are really fascinated by its history, and so it's actually surprisingly easy to find out the story of these things.
There's a body of enthusiasts you can call upon. Don't even have to go on the internet. Yeah. Just ask somebody. Exactly.
And if it may be on the internet, it may well be in a book somewhere. The Toronto archives are really remarkable, and they provide a lot of information, and they have a huge collection of photos online. In fact, we found a photo of the street after we bought our house. We looked up and we were like, oh, this is, so we could see which houses were built when and what used to be here, that kind of thing. And Jane's Walks, for example, often have a historical aspect, the Toronto Heritage Society. There's an amazing resource of people to kind of bring out the depth of the city in that way.
When you do go walking in other cities, what does that reflect back onto Toronto for you? I mean, when you're going walking elsewhere, what does it make you realize about here where you live?
Every city's different, so it's hard to say. And I mean, I love the experience of walking in other cities and experiencing them. Sometimes it's that, Toronto is not beautiful. Right?
It's not really ugly, though, is it? I mean, if you go around.
Opinions vary. I don't think so, but opinions vary, I have to tell you. But Toronto's also very hodgepodge, right? So, and I love that. I think that gives a huge variety. But if you're walking in New York or, Paris, for example, you might realize that, they have these beautiful vistas of fairly consistently attractive buildings, which is not something you can really say of Toronto anywhere. Other cities, I went to San Francisco recently. Toronto's very flat.
Sure,
I discovered. Sure. Although there is actually one significant hill that makes a difference. And of course there's the ravines, which make a difference as well. Wow. But Toronto is a city, someone described as a city in reverse, where all the elevation is downwards rather than upwards. So you have a flat city with big gouges in it, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. A lot of cities are actually, especially in North America, have a lot of similarities to Toronto. I mean, there's the hodgepodgeness, there's similar kind of attractive buildings, similar randomness of attractive and unattractive. So, I mean, Toronto is very much a North American, especially a Midwestern North American city, in a lot of ways. It's just that it's, certainly one thing is the, kind of what I was alluding to earlier, the density of active spaces. So there's not that sense of huge gaps in the city. There are areas that are not that interesting, but they're not gaps.
There's no dead zones.
There's no dead zones or holes in the city until you get into the industrial areas in the suburbs. But so that's, I think, something that I do notice is that Toronto, you can walk for a long, long way and never kind of find yourself in a space that is a dead zone, completely dead zone. I wouldn't say, it may be less lively than others, and the concentration of basically as soon as you get away from commercial office space or retail, right away there's houses, right? And that's true of all of the older city of Toronto, at least, where there's never that this is business, and then there's kind of a gap, and then there's where people live. It's very consistent.
That's true. I asked previously about whether the reading you do, the sort of urbanist reading you do, always applies to Toronto, but it seems more like Toronto, given these characteristics of Toronto, other cities have a lot to learn from it, considering, I mean, you could always find something that applies to your own city if you don't come from Toronto in Toronto. And do you get a sense of, with spacing, that there's a lot of interest now, more interest than there was in how things work in Toronto, how things have worked for Toronto from other cities, from people of other cities?
I think so, yes. And Torontonians tend to be very down on their city. Despite it's a weird thing where there's this love of the city, but there's also this sort of discourse of Toronto sucks, even within the city. So a lot of people in Toronto would be like, oh, we do things terribly. And they're not really conscious of the fact that Toronto is actually doing things extremely well and has a lot of times in the past. They tend to focus on the negative. Perhaps that's true of every city. I don't know.
Certainly Los Angeles does the same thing. Yeah. It's the main discourse is how bad it is, but then you realize nobody actually thinks that because they're still there and they're actually enjoying themselves. So why go on about how bad it is? I can't figure it out.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Toronto sucks, and yet you're still living here, and you have a huge network of people.
You're not going anywhere.
And you moved here or whatever, right? And perhaps it's healthy for a city to always be trying to improve itself and to always be, And I think that there is this dual thing. So there's also a Toronto love that's very strong as well. Yeah. And of course, I think Toronto, I mean, it was kind of in the 70s that Toronto kind of shifted its direction and as it were, avoided a lot of the pitfalls that happened to a lot of other middle North American cities.
It never got the completely hollowed out downtown, for example.
So in the 70s, there were specific policies. Obviously expressways were stopped. That happened in a lot of cities. Happened in Toronto. It was a fundamental important thing. But more than that, exactly the sense of even if the neighborhoods around the downtown weren't exactly wealthy, but they all continued to be active. They were places where immigrants moved to. They were places where bohemians or university professors lived, or students. They all stayed full of life, and that helped the retail survive in those areas as well. There was never wholesale demolition for speculative purposes. So no one ever flattened a block and left it into a parking lot until they could build something.
And in many cases never did in certain cities.
I mean, perhaps that happened a little bit, but not to the same extent, not to a really damaging extent. I believe actually that part of it may be that I think it's actually surprisingly, and I'm not an expert on this, so I could be wrong, but I think it's actually much more difficult to expropriate land in Canada than it is in the United States, which is kind of ironic given that Canada is seen as being more government-powered and the United States is more individualistic and property-oriented. But there was never that ability. Well, that's not true. There were some cases like Regent Park where areas were expropriated and flattened and new things were built. But it was, I think, always more difficult in Toronto and in North America. And so there was never a very extensive amount of that. A lot of stuff was really left up to, if developers wanted to build something, they had to buy all the land themselves, and they had to come up with something and put it together. And so I think that helped avoid that kind of hollowing out thing and the sort of having the very large kind of poor estates. We certainly have housing estates, but they were never very super dominant. And another thing is that there was some good planning. So even in the suburbs, they insisted on having tower neighborhoods. So there's actually some reasonable density in their suburban areas. And that enables transit to be viable in those suburban areas. So there was some good planning in Toronto in the 60s and 70s. There was some good politics. And together they helped avoid any kind of the sort of disastrous hollowing out. And so I think that's contributed now to the density of building in the downtown, because what's happening is a lot of space is the few spaces that were available to build densely were in the downtown parking lots owned by developers and, smaller buildings, stuff like that. We've been able to actually build this great density without necessarily flattening too many neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods that have existed have been a lot of times, there's been infill, the existing buildings have been renovated. So, so far it's up and down, but it's going pretty well. And of course, with these very valuable residential neighborhoods, I mean, that gives a strong incentive to keep those neighborhoods because they are very valuable. And that they survived until people could really appreciate them, as it were. And now, of course, we have the reverse problem where only, they're becoming unaffordable. But at least those neighborhoods survived and are now being appreciated as like really vibrant, a great way to live in a sort of densely packed housing area, which is true really across the old city of Toronto.
Finally, for somebody looking to come to grips with Toronto, to understand it as soon as they can, if possible, what kind of walks do you recommend they take?
Oh, that's a good question. I used to, when friends came to visit, I used to take them on a walk that would start at the University of Toronto campus, which is quite pretty, and then would circle around through the Annex and Kensington Market, then Chinatown. And then if they were really hardcore, we would either walk along Queen Street West, or we would walk down towards the office district in the center of town. depending on what they were interested in. And that kind of gives an overview of different kinds of neighborhoods in Toronto, some very vibrant areas, really neat areas, sort of ethnic neighborhoods, that sense of sort of the long, interesting, varied sort of retail strip. Right. You can walk if you do that walk, you can end up walking for 5 hours if you want to. It depends. If you want to walk all the way down to the harbourfront, for example, you can do that. Or if you just want to keep walking along Queen West all the way to Parkdale, you can do that. And I mean, I want to say it's like a lot of that is not super fancy, right? Like, it's not like it's gorgeous, or it's not that it's like super shishi or anything like that. That's kind of the appeal of it. Right. It gives you a real mix. Some of it's going to be shishi, some of it's going to be very low key, some of it's going to be very busy, some of it's going to be quiet.
Right. And any one of those things would be dull if it was all that.
Exactly. But it's amazing that within 2 hours you can see so many different areas and different types of neighborhood. So that's, I would say that is probably still my quick intro to Toronto kind of walk, as it were. And there's lots of places to stop for coffee along the way, or stop for dinner, important. Stop for dumplings in Chinatown. If people are interested in shopping, there's going to be some interesting shopping there. If people are interested in architecture, there's tons of various kinds of architecture. If you're looking there's a mix of quiet and lively. There's a mix of kinds of people. You're going to be in a somewhat bourgeois area. You're going to be in a very trendy area. You're going to be in a very kind of bohemian area, all mixed together. You're going to see some streetcars. It's a good mix, and that kind of, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. The trick is always finding Kensington Market. It took me several years in Toronto before I actually figured out exactly how to find Kensington Market, because there's no obvious sign of it from a main street. You just have to know that this is the street you go down, or this is the street you go down to find it. But once you find it, it's a lot of fun. So yeah, that I would say that's probably starting off point, and of course you can modify that depending on what you're interested in. That also goes near the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is an interesting building and has a good collection if that's what you're interested in. So there's a lot of sort of choices there as well in terms of where you want to put the emphasis.
It is a city where there's a bit of everything. You've got the choices. The choices are all there. It's just up to you to make them right. There's the challenge. Yeah.
And I mean, it's a bit of a challenge for visitors to Toronto because there's not the obvious destinations. No. There's not here are the 5 gorgeous buildings that you want to see, or right, whatever. Like, even if you go to Washington or New York, there's here are tourist destinations. Toronto, other than the CN Tower, it's hard to say that there's a tourist destination. And that's why I think walking is possibly the best way to get to know it. Because that way you get to experience all the different things and see, all the different locations. I mean, the great thing to do in Toronto is go to the Toronto Island if it's the summer and just hang out there. But that's not something that's going to be obvious. There's not something drawing you there. It's just this odd fact that we have this lovely bucolic island right across from our downtown.
There's no sign pointing to it.
There's no sign pointing to it. Almost everyone who goes there is a local. There's no fee other than the ferry to get across. Yeah. There's no specific attraction on the island unless you're a kid and you want to go to Centertown, which is a mini amusement park. It's really just a place to go and walk around and maybe have a picnic and look at people and look at the city and hang out. So yeah, Toronto is it's even if you're a tourist, definitely it's not the thing to do. There's walk and see lots of things, basically.
And now you have some suggestions for Toronto, the city where you can do whatever you want, provided you know where to find it. Here on Notebook on Cities and Culture, I've been speaking with Dylan Reid. He is a senior editor at Spacing Magazine. He was on the Pedestrian Committee, the Toronto Pedestrian Committee. He is a co-founder of Walk Toronto, and he's certainly the walkingest person I've met so far in Toronto, but I've only been here one day or so. So we'll see if you get. Are there contenders? Are there?
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, okay.
Sean is the other walking
Sean
guy.
McAuliffe, whom you'll hear from later on the show, listeners. But you guys be the judge. Dylan, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.